Today's speaker is Dr. Lee Allen Dugatkin. He is a professor and distinguished university scholar in the Department of Biology at the University of Louisville. He is an animal behaviorist, evolutionary biologist, and historian of science. Dr. Dugatkin is the author of over 175 articles on evolution and behavior. He has published 3 books on the evolution of cooperation among different animal species, or within animal species. He has had the privilege of speaking over 150 major universities all around the world, and it's American, The New Scientist, Newsday, The Washington Post, Cerebrum, Bioscience, and the Wilson Quarterly. I give you Dr. Dugatkin.
Hello, let me just now get my slides up here, and hopefully this will work if I now do. So are you seeing what you should be seeing?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. Okay, now that I know. So I am delighted to be here for a lot of reasons. One is that I love the chance to talk about this topic, social networks and non-humans. I also did my master's degree in evolution and behavior at the State University of New York in Albany, so I know the area very well. And I am also a humanist, so it's a pleasure to talk with fellow humanists today. So about 35 years ago, I was working on my PhD in the area of evolution and animal behavior. And at that time, in the late 80s, I wasn't really studying social networks in non-humans because nobody was. It really wasn't on the radar at that time. But I was studying something eerily close, which will serve as kind of a stepping stone to understanding social networks in non-humans. So at that time, one of the things that I was interested in is how animals choose their mates. And the leading theory was that in order to understand that, you basically needed to understand genetics, that there were genetic underpinnings to how animals choose their mates, and that's absolutely the case. I, though, was interested in whether there might be sociocultural factors that also play a role in how animals choose their mates, and I was looking at this in guppies, which you can find in the pet store, but are naturally found in the streams of Trinidad and Tobago. And so at the time, people thought that there was nice evidence to suggest that females were using the amount of color that a male had to determine if they were going to mate with him, which is absolutely correct. But as I say, I was interested in the role of social cultural factors. And so I ran a little experiment on the role of imitation in mate choice. And so basically what you're looking at here is a setup that was done in the laboratory. So you have a female, and she has the choice between 2 males, one down here in orange, and one up here in the right, male 1 and male 2. Now, the difference between this experiment and others that had been done is that next to one of the males is another female that's expressing a preference for that male, in this case, male 2. And my question was pretty simple. It was, does the observing female, female 1, does she have a preference for the male that's being preferred by another female, that is male 2, or does she not have a preference for that male? And it turns out that she, in fact, had an overwhelming preference for males that other females had chosen. So in a very simple system with just a few animals, information was being transferred within the group. Female 1 learned something by watching female 2, that is, other females like male 2, and I'm now going to do that. So this sociocultural information was spreading through a group, a small group, albeit, but still a group. At the same time, or a few years later, I was looking at similar things, but in a very different behavioral context. So a student of mine, Ryan Early, and I were looking at fighting behavior in swordtail fish. You can see a couple of the swordtails right here. Swordtails fight for access to food. Males, like you see here, they're the ones that have those long sword tails. They fight for access to females. And again, the leading thought was whoever wins those fights gets access to mating opportunities with females. And that's in fact correct. But I was interested again in whether there were social cultural factors that played a role too. And so what I did was I would have male 1 and 2 engage in a fight, an aggressive interaction. And for example, male 1 might defeat male 2. While this was going on, a third male was watching the encounter. He was essentially spying on what was going on among the other 2 males as they were fighting. And that spying behavior dramatically influenced his behavior. So if male 3, who had spied on this event, had future interactions with the winner of the fight he had seen, male 1, then he was fairly timid when he interacted with male 1. If the spy's interactions later with male 2, who he had seen lose, then he was particularly aggressive. So again, what we have is this information that's being transferred among group members, information flowing through a group. Not quite a social network, but getting close. So let's start our discussion of social networks with some basic definitions. So if you go into the Webster Dictionary, you'll see a social network as a network of individuals that are connected by interpersonal relationships. And that definition is broad. It includes ourselves. We have social networks, not just on Facebook and Twitter or X and Mastodon and various other places, but at work, among our friends, among our family. I'm going to use social networks a bit broader, defining it as a group of individuals through which information flows and in which an individual's actions affect others, both directly and indirectly. And what I'm going to make a case for is that over the years, animal behaviorists have found these complex social dynamics, these social networks, play a huge role in shaping animal behavior. They play an important role in determining what individuals are going to eat, who they're going to mate with. They affect parent-offspring dynamics. They affect fighting behavior. They affect how you navigate through your environment. They affect communication. They affect play behavior. They affect cooperation. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of this in just a moment. But to get us to a place where we all understand, so how does a real animal network, what does it look like, and what are some of the key factors? I'm going to walk you through some basics. So this red dashed line that I've highlighted, that is what's known as a link or an edge in a social network. So here's a social network among a bunch of birds. You can see these links or edges all over the place in the network. They represent either the flow of information or the effect that one individual has on another. So in this case, the bottom bird at the end of that red dashed arrow and the top bird affect one another in one way or another. The information flows between them. Those interactions and the information can flow directly, as we've just seen, or they can have indirect effects as well. And the indirect effects become very, very important, as you'll see as we look at the examples in just a few minutes. So if we, for example, look at the highlighted bird in this network, we've already said, here's a link with this other bird. Well, now this other bird on top in the gray circle has interactions with that bird, which means that the first bird's interactions with this bird might affect this bird's interaction with that bird. That bird then interacts with this bird, and the information or the effect of the interaction can flow through an entire network of individuals. In networks, including in human networks, but in the social networks and non-humans we're going to look at today, there are hubs. And when I talk about a hub, I mean an individual through which lots of information and interactions flow. So for example, the highlighted bird down here, it has links or edges with all the birds that I have shown here. It's a hub in the network. Information flows through it. If we look at another bird, we would argue that this bird is not quite as central. It's not nearly the hub the other bird is because it doesn't interact directly with as many individuals. Now, another way to kind of look at this in a slightly more simplified version is we can just basically count the number of friends that an individual has in a network, be it a network of humans or a network of birds, as here. So if we look at this bird, we would say it has 4 friends because it has links to 4 other individuals. Right? This bird has 4 friends because it has links to 4 individuals. This bird in gray now, it has 3 friends because it interacts with those 3 individuals in pinkish color. But the thing about the gray bird that becomes so important is that while it has the fewest friends in this network, it has something else going for it, which is that it has the most friends of friends. So its friend over here has 3 friends. Its friend over here has 3 friends. And its friend over here has 3 friends. It has 9 friends of friends, which is more than anyone else in the network. So what that means is that if friends of friends matter, this bird is going to be influenced by everybody in this network. Okay, so now that we have a few basic definitions and concepts of a social network, let's look at some of the amazing work that my friends and colleagues in animal behavior have done. So the first example that I'm going to give you focuses on rhesus macaques monkeys. You see a bunch of them here, and what they're doing is they're grooming each other, which means that they're picking parasites off one another. This is a very common behavior in non-humans. It's important in terms of health. You're picking parasites off others. At the same time, it also does other things. This grooming behavior reduces stress. It makes the animals feel calmer. Okay. These animals that we're going to look at, these rhesus macaques, they live in a unique place. They live on Cayo Santiago Island, just off the coast of mainland Puerto Rico. Cayo Santiago is a living natural laboratory. And the reason that I say this is that no people live on Cayo Santiago. The only primates there are the rhesus macaques. Humans are allowed onto the island to study them, and they come each morning. They take a little ferry over, they spend the day there, and then they go back. So the macaques have full run of the island. Humans can only come and go at certain times. Everything is sort of flipped on its head in terms of the way we typically think about human interactions with other primates. In fact, it's the humans that have to go into cages when they eat the meals rather than the macaques on this island. Cayo Santiago is not a native habitat to rhesus macaques. What happened was in 1938, a primatologist by the name of Clarence Carpenter, who we see right here, went over to India and gathered up 500 rhesus macaques from 12 different districts in India, put them into crates, boarded them onto the SS Como, and came over to Cayo Santiago. There you can see the crates that I've highlighted in red. They took the crates off of the ship, put them on shore, and then what they did was first they marked all of the macaques, giving them unique tattoos. You can also tell which macaque is which by various natural patterns and things about them, but the tattoos guarantee that you'll know who's who. And ever since then, they've used similar techniques. Then what they did, and again, this is in 1938, 1939, is they released all the macaques onto the island. They, again would come at certain times of the day onto this island, and the rest of the time the macaques had free run. When the humans would come, they would provision them with corn, and they would basically take data on them. And so you can see Carpenter and some of his colleagues doing this very early on. I mean, this was actually quite big news. Life magazine covered it. They sent their best photographer, Hans Meith, to look at what was going on here. And the macaques are still there. Their descendants are still there. Today, if you go to Cayo Santiago, there are anywhere between 1,200 and 1,700 macaques there. So I mentioned that the macaques groom one another. They remove parasites, which has health effects and also lowers stress hormone levels. And an animal behaviorist by the name of Lauren Brent and her colleagues were interested in social networks in the grooming behavior of these macaques. Who grooms who? How many other individuals does a given individual groom? Who are the friends of the friends that you groom? Who are the friends of the friends of the friends that you groom? And so they took data, detailed data on the grooming behavior, and they built the kind of social networks that we looked at earlier, except now instead of birds in the social network, there were macaques. And they found some interesting things. The first one was that, and they focused on females. The first one was that individuals who had stronger friendships, and when I say a stronger friendship in a network, I mean that those links that I talked about between individuals, you can represent them as thin lines or thick lines. If it's a thick line, it means they interact all the time. If it's a thin line, then they only interact once in a while. So the link will still be there, but the intensity of the interaction can be different. And what they found was that deep friendships that involve lots and lots of bouts of grooming with one another, if individuals had lots of friends like that, they had higher survival probabilities. And also, remarkably, and really important from an evolutionary perspective, because the number of babies you produce, that's the currency on which natural selection operates. It turns out that in these grooming networks among females, the more friends of a friend, of your friend, the more offspring you produce. So individuals who had more friends of friends in these social grooming networks produced more babies. So they had this basic notion of how social networks with respect to grooming operated. Here's Lauren taking some data on the macaques. Here's one of our students taking data on the macaques. And nowadays they use iPads and iPhones and various other high-tech tools to do this. So they have this basic information, and then something happens. In 2017, Hurricane Maria hits. And the eye of, and the brunt of Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, including Cayo Santiago. And this was an absolutely devastating storm. So here are two pictures of Cayo. On the left, before the hurricane hit, and on the right, after the hurricane hit. On the order of 60% of the vegetation on Cayo Santiago was absolutely decimated by the hurricane. Remarkably, and they don't quite understand how yet, no macaques were killed. So what happened was this devastating hurricane comes through. And of course, the researchers are, their first thoughts immediately are the animals okay? Right? They didn't know that no macaques were killed until they went and studied it. And of course, the researchers who were in North America were very concerned with the on-the-ground field researchers, mostly native Puerto Ricans, who were doing this sort of day-to-day work. And they were very concerned about their safety and the animal safety. Once they found out everybody was safe, they began to think about something, which was, they knew, like I say, something about these social grooming networks. But we had a very weak understanding of how the dynamics of social networks change as a result of natural catastrophe. Now, this has implications for the macaques, for other animals. It also has implications for us because we deal with natural catastrophes, and our social networks are often what we turn to deal with this. But we have very little understanding of how that works. Now, all of a sudden, Lauren Brent and her team, they know what was happening with the networks and grooming behavior before Hurricane Maria. And now, once things settle down a little bit and the animals aren't as freaked out as they were right after the storm, they can go and look at the social networks and see how they changed as a result of a natural catastrophe. And what they found was this. So well, let me step back. They thought there were really sort of two things that might happen. One is that animals might increase the number of interactions with their friends in the grooming network. So they might interact more with friend number one after the hurricane than before the hurricane. So they might strengthen their friendships. Right? That didn't happen. The other thing that might have happened was that the animals acquired more friends. That after the hurricane, they developed more friendships than what they had before. And that is exactly what happened. So you can see on the schematic that the pre-hurricane social grooming network basically had individuals who had fewer friends, but the post-hurricane individuals had formed more friendships. What's more, again, like I said earlier, friends of friends matter. Before the hurricane, they affected how many babies you had. It really matters. And it turns out it mattered. The friends of friends changed and affected the network in a fundamental way because of the hurricane. So basically, we said before that individuals formed more direct friendships. How did they do that? They did it through friends of their friends. So for example, take this macaque I've highlighted in green. It's friends with the macaque in red. And that macaque is friends with the macaque in purple, but the green macaque isn't. If you look after the network, the green macaque is friends with the purple macaque. And this was a general phenomenon. If you want to know who the new friends are going to be, you look at who that individual's original friends were and who their friends were. And then you can predict who their new friends will be. So let me just go back here. I'm sorry, I went the wrong way. This work on the macaques is still going on today. They are looking at all sorts of questions. So we know that before the hurricane, these networks affected survival, the number of offspring you had. Now they're asking, do all the changes that we just talked about that occurred after the hurricane, more friends, how more friends were acquired, did this also affect survivorship and the number of babies? And they're working on that right now. So perhaps if I come back in a couple of years, I can give you more insight on that. But no doubt, in fact, those dynamics after the hurricane did affect survival and reproduction, although exactly how, we don't know yet. So now I'm going to switch gears and give you the second of the three examples I'm going to talk about. This may be my favorite. And the reason it's my favorite is first of all, it involves dolphins, and anything that involves dolphins is going to be interesting. But what's really amazing about this is that this system involves social networks in dolphins and social networks in humans simultaneously, networks that affect one another. So to understand this, we need to step back. And this fellow right here, Paulo Simeo Lopez, has been studying bottleneck dolphins for the last 30 years along an 800-kilometer stretch south of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And he is studying 9 different populations of dolphins there that do something that almost no other dolphins do, and almost no other non-human animals do. And that is, they cooperate with humans. They cooperate with humans to secure more food for the humans and to secure more food for themselves. And as they're doing this, it's all within the context of social networks. So to understand how this plays out, along the coast where Paulo is studying these animals, these dolphin populations, every year there is a huge migration of mullet fish that come. And these migrations involve millions of mullet. And the mullet is a critical item in the dolphin's diet. And it's also a critical element in the local fishermen's economy. This mullet migration is one of the key economic factors that these fishermen depend on every single year to make ends meet. Mullet are big fish. There's a lot of money in mullet fishing. And what you will see during the migration of the mullet is at any given stretch, you'll see 50 fishermen like you see here, and they have these large nets called tarafa. They're circular nylon nets. And what they will do is, if they think there is mullet there, right, they toss their large net out there and they pull in a bunch of the mullet. Now, the fishermen have a problem. And the problem is that this water is very muddy. And so it's very difficult for the fishermen to know when the mullet are there. The dolphins, who also feed on the mullet, and it's an important element in their diet, they also have a problem. And their problem is that the mullet are, relatively speaking, very large prey items. It's not easy for dolphins to catch mullet. Right? But they don't have the problem the fishermen have, because the dolphins can detect the mullet using their sonar systems that are essentially built into their foreheads. So it doesn't matter if the water is murky or it isn't murky. So both humans and dolphins want the mullet, and each has a problem. The fishermen can't see it. The dolphins have trouble catching the mullet as they're kind of streaming along in their schools. So what happens during this migration is really remarkable. So what you will see is that some dolphins will signal to the fishermen that mullet are present. Right? And the way that they do this is they raise their back out of the water and they curve it. And then they slap their heads or their tails on the water. And they only do this when the mullet are there and when the fishermen are there. The fishermen then know that mullet are present and they cast their nets. So the fishermen now get what they want. So you're looking at one fisherman here. When 50 fishermen do this, it causes havoc for the mullet. And they break up the way that they tightly are grouped in school. And they basically panic and just sprint out. Many of them sprint right into the mouths of dolphins. So the dolphins can now feed on them in their panic, and the fishermen can feed on them. Both sides get something out of this cooperative interaction. Now, Paulo began to think that a social network analysis might even allow them to understand this amazing between species cooperation even better. And so he asked a really fundamental question, okay? And that was this: only some of the dolphins signal fishermen, and the fishermen know who they are. So Paulo talks to them, and the fishermen will tell you, that over there, that's a good dolphin. That means they signal. That over there, that's not a good dolphin. They won't tell me when fish are there. Okay. What Paulo wanted to know was, did the signalers, the ones that signaled the fishermen, did those dolphins swim together? Did they group together? And did they group together even outside of the time when the mullet migration was going on? Were they somehow cliques Were there cliques of dolphins who were signalers to fishermen and cliques of dolphins that were not signalers to fishermen? And the way that you do this is you build social networks. So when Paulo did this, what he found was that there were three very different cliques, kind of sub-social networks within the population of one of these groups of dolphins that had about 35 dolphins or so. So in clique number one that you're looking at here, all of the dolphins cooperated with the fishermen. That is, they all signaled the fishermen when the mullet were present. They were cooperative with one another, right? And what this clique tells you is that they spent their time together all year round. And the mullet migration is only, I don't know, a couple of weeks maybe, but these signalers stay together all the time. Exactly why? Don't know yet, but they do. There's another clique of dolphins in the same population. Everyone in that clique does not signal fishermen. And they too form a clique. They are a sub-network here. But what you can see in that purple sub-network is there just aren't as many links. There aren't as many lines here as there are on the green one. What that means is that the clique of non-cooperators, they're staying with one another, but they're not interacting with one another nearly as much as the dolphins in the clique made up of these cooperators. So there are two very different cliques going on here. And then there's a third one, which in some ways is arguably the most interesting. So in clique number 3, all of the dolphins except one don't signal fishermen. So a triangle, a diamond means you're a non-signaler, and you can see that most of the dolphins in clique 3 are non-signalers. But if you go down to the bottom, to dolphin number 20, it's in a circle. That means it's a signaler. That one animal signals fishermen, and all of the others in that clique, all the others that it spends its time with all year round, don't. Paulo calls this dolphin 20 a social broker. And the reason that he does that is dolphin 20 is the dolphin that spends most time, and it spends that time with the individuals in clique 1. So that is, it's part of clique 3. But of all the dolphins in any of the cliques, it's the one that spends the most time with individuals in a separate group. And who is that? What is that separate group? It's the one full of signalers. So clique 3 is this strange mixture. And what Paulo wants to know, and hopefully what future work will tell us, is does dolphin 20 eventually influence the other dolphins in its group enough that they begin to signal? Or do the other dolphins in clique 3 eventually have a strong enough effect on dolphin 20 that it doesn't signal anymore and it doesn't act as a social broker? We'll see. But even what we know now is fascinating. It explains cooperation between species, and this sort of thing is exceptionally rare and exceptionally interesting. Okay, so the last of the examples I want to talk to you about today, and I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't talk about chimpanzees and social networks. Everything chimpanzee is complex, and that includes their social networks. And the social networks that we are going to look at revolve around, let me go back here, revolve around the chimpanzees creating a completely new and novel tool, which is a moss sponge that you can see I keep saying dolphin, the chimpanzee in the middle of this figure with its fingers around something, that's a moss sponge. And we'll come back to that in 1 second. So the work that we're going to look at was done by Kate Hobater that you see here in the Budongo forest in Uganda. And Kate was doing her PhD work there. And she actually wasn't interested in social networks or tool use or anything. She was basically studying the gestural communication. But one day, November 14th, 2011, at 9:05 in the morning, Kate remembers it because she recorded it. She saw something that she had never seen before. And that was that the dominant chimp in the group, a chimp that she called Nick, created a new tool. What it did was it took a bunch of moss, it clumped it together into a sponge, and then what it would do is in the Budongo forest, it rains a lot, but then it stops. And there are a lot of these little water holes that the chimpanzees use to drink water. And having a sponge that you can take and put into a little watering hole is a lot easier than trying to scoop up water that's going to slip through your hand and cup it into your mouth. It's an incredibly useful tool. Nobody had ever seen chimpanzees make a moss sponge before. Kate all of a sudden sees it. I'm going to show you a video. It's a little fuzzy, but it gets better, where you will see a chimpanzee coming down from a tree with some food. And then when it gets down, you're going to see another chimpanzee who has a moss sponge in its hand and is going to use it to dip it into the water and then take it out and suck it. So there's the chimp on the tree. It comes down, it has something in its mouth, and that chimpanzee on the bottom, although you can't see the sponge very well, you can kind of see it there briefly. It's taking it, it's sticking it into the water. It's then taking the sponge, putting it into its mouth and squeezing out all the water. So for one thing, Kate was stunned because nobody had ever seen this before. Creation of a new tool and literally being there at the moment of creation is an extraordinarily rare thing. I mean, Kate knew how lucky she was. So she started going back. So when she was there, like I say, to study gestural communication, how the chimps communicate with each other. And the way she was doing that was she videotaped all the time, 5-6 hours a day. So all of a sudden she went back and she started looking at her videotapes for more information, maybe about this sponging behavior, because what she noticed just by watching, even before she looked at the videotapes, was that after Nick, the dominant male, learned this, created this sponge, all of a sudden, some of the other chimps began making their own moss sponges and using them, right? But they didn't do that out of the blue. What Kate found was information about these new tools, these new moss sponges were spreading through the social network of the chimpanzees that she was studying. So here is Nick, symbolized by NK, the first individual, that's why there's a one there, who learned to make a sponge. So this other individual, NB2, I'm sorry, that we're going to look at up in that second circle, saw Nick make a sponge, and only after that did NB2 start to make a sponge. And Kate had very strict definitions for what constituted one chimpanzee observing another use a sponge. NB noticed this. She's now the second individual to use a sponge. Right? Then NT, another chimpanzee, also noticed Nick doing this, and then NT started making a sponge. HY also noticed Nick making a sponge, and then she did it, and so did HL, up on the top, HL3. Now I've expanded the entire group of chimpanzees, and let me just say that the individuals that are in smaller circles, they were present, but they never learned to sponge, to make sponges. So not everybody did. We've looked at the three individuals on the top, and we see how it spread through a social network. Now let's look at the individuals on the bottom. Sorry. So KW, a chimpanzee that went by the name of Quara, started to sponge. Then JN and KR saw KW starting to sponge. And they did that. JM saw them, and JM did it. KB saw them do it, and KB did it. KZ is there, it's watching KB, but it doesn't do it. So not everybody does it. So we see how this is spreading through the social network, but there's one problem. And the problem is KW, or Quara, the chimpanzee down here. Quara, and Kate went back to the videotapes over and over again, and she found no evidence that Quara actually watched anybody else make a sponge. Everyone else, besides Nick, who created the first sponge, everybody else who used a sponge only did it after they saw somebody else do it. And we kind of see how it spreads through the network this way. But Quara never saw anybody do it. And yet, there she was doing it. It seems sort of impossible that this was completely independent. Like Nick did it, but the fact that anybody did it was astonishing. The fact that two chimpanzees would come up with this right when Kate was watching independent, it just struck her as really hard to imagine. So she went back and she looked at videotapes over and over again, and then she found something. She found the clue that she was looking for. It was true that Quara never saw anybody else use a sponge. But for 10 seconds on a videotape, what Kate discovered was Quara had actually seen, I'm sorry, let me see here. Quara had actually found a used sponge on the ground and picked it up and began exploring it. And she learned how to make her own sponge by this interaction with a used sponge, an artifact, what we would call an archaeological artifact. She didn't see anybody else, but the actual item, the artifact, gave her enough information. And that was critical, right? Because the whole social network down in the bottom here involving Quara, that part of the network never would have existed, or would have taken a lot longer to exist if Quara wasn't there. And she learned it through this odd way. But once she did, it spread throughout the rest of the social network. So not surprisingly, these social networks in chimpanzees are astonishingly complex. So just going to end with a couple of minutes just to get us thinking about, what sort of things people might be doing in the future. I should also say that in the book I've written on this is The Well-Connected Animal, I have dozens and dozens of examples like this that we talked about today, and everything from honeybees and crickets to kangaroos and whales and every species you can imagine. Here, I just want to spend a little time on what might be coming next for the study of social networks. And so what you're looking at here is, in 2018, a group at the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior in Germany launched a satellite that had an antenna on it, and the sole function of this antenna was to pick up data on animals migrating all throughout the world. So basically, what had happened was researchers had placed little micro tags, basically little GPS-like tracking devices, either on the skin or on the feathers or under the skin, of 800 different species, from elephants to bats. And this satellite, the antenna here, was picking up data on where those animals were, down to a matter of feet. They could determine where these animals were. So they were tracking goats. You can see the little tracking devices on them. So you can see them. Well, actually, you can't. Those are just the things on their ears. Those are just other individual markers. They probably have them injected under their skin. The birds that you're looking at, cranes, they had them. They were carrying them on their back. Now, all of a sudden, think of what kind of stuff can be done with this. So not only is the satellite gathering this information, but there's an app, an animal tracker app, that allows the researchers and also anyone else who wants to know where any of these animals in any of the 800 species are. Think of the kind of data you could get on social networks in animals that are migrating around the world. And this technology, it's not just satellites up in the air. Basically, there are devices that are put on vampire bats that allow you to know where the vampire bats are. But these little GPS-like tracking devices, they also talk to each other so that when a bat interacts with another bat, the sensors talk to each other. You know exactly what those animals are doing. The possibilities here in terms of social networks are endless. A few other things to think about. Nowadays, people who study conservation biology are interested in social networks. They're interested in it because they're interested in animal behavior. They're interested in it because they're interested in disease. Social networks in some species that you might be interested in are also the networks that disease moves along, right? And if you're a conservation biologist, you want to understand how those diseases move from animal to animal that you're studying. Well, they move along the social networks of those animals because that's what gives us a picture of who's interacting with who. And that can tell us how disease spreads as well as how information or something like that spreads within a group. And so this sort of thing is going on all the time these days. I think what I'm going to do now is just stop and I will take any questions or comments that you might have. So give me just a minute here and I will can you hear me okay now? I don't
Sorry
know.
about that. I muted you by accident. Sorry, Lee.
Okay, so you can hear me okay.
Yes, I had a very interesting presentation.
Yeah.
A couple things came to mind, a question for you. When
Yes.
you're talking about how messages are transmitted through social networks, it reminds me a little bit. I came to think about the telephone game where somebody whispers a message and it goes to somebody else. And how well does the message carry through in those networks in animals? Or we have the same distortion we see in humans.
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the things I have fun with in the book is I actually talk about the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, which is pretty much the same thing. It basically looks at how you can connect individuals. So a lot of times at one level we don't know details of that yet. At another level, I think it's important to realize that the information that's traveling along these networks is typically it's kind of dichotomous. It's like, did you prefer X or did you prefer Y? Do you lose a fight or do you win a fight? Do you eat food X or do you eat food Y? So the information traveling isn't nearly as complex as the kind of information that's traveling along in a telephone game. And so one would expect less distortion. But how much less distortion, I think at this point we just don't know.
Okay, great.
And I'm going to ask a strange favor. As you ask me the questions, I am briefly going to stand up so that my hips feel better. And I will keep answering the question as you go along.
Okay.
So maybe what I'm going to do just for a minute is turn my video off and you can ask me that questions and I'll come back on in a second. So
okay. Beverly in the room has a question. Beverly, come up and use the microphone.
Thank you. I might have an unusual question, but maybe you can all understand why I'm thinking of this. Between human beings and their way that they communicate like animals, we communicate by talking. And in today's world, I've been wondering, what does the people have as a core denominator that the animals had to be friends? Think of one politician and they join that group over the other group, maybe. And what is making those people in those two, let's say, political groups have the same kind of combination of the way they communicate that makes those people in those groups. Does that make sense? Like who's a Republican, who's a Democrat, but what's making them for that one candidate? And you looked at animals, the way they communicated and they stayed in their groups, and you had different groups, and you talked about that one person who was in one group, but also was communicating with the second group when you had three groups. So
Yeah.
that's where my idea in my head came from. So I'm just curious about you explaining something like that.
Okay, so it's a good question, and I am going to be a little bit weaselly on the first part of your question, which is that I'm no more an expert on human social networks, particularly as with respect to politics, than any one of you are, and so I don't want to present myself as somebody who has some deep insight into that. But at the same time, let me just tell you that. And this is another reason I find studying social networks in non-humans not only interesting in of itself, interested in this, but the other thing is that if you see something over and over again in many different species of animals, in many different contexts, then you might be able to get an idea of like the core things that matter. And maybe they're the same core things that matter in humans. Let me just give you one more example along the lines that you're talking about. It's not in humans, but maybe it can just get us thinking a little bit. So there's this wonderful social network that people have studied in house finches, this common bird, and this study was done at the University of Arizona, and they had marked 10,000 birds, and they were studying social networks and mating behavior. And I think maybe you'll get a better sense of what I mean in just 1 minute, why this is like your question. So they were studying mating behavior and mate choice in these animals. And so in house finches, females really like males that have lots and lots of red feathers, red plumage. Okay, and we knew this. What the social network analysis showed was this. If you were one of those really colorful males that was attractive to females, you stayed where you were in your group because you would do well in terms of mating. If you were a male who had less red plumage than the others in your group, then what you did was you left and you searched for other social networks. You went around sampling other groups. Where did you settle? You settled in the group where your amount of red was, relatively speaking, high. It wasn't as much as the male in the group you left, because that's why you left, because you knew your chances there were low. And so you went around looking for places where you could do better. I think that at a very basic level, that explains some of what people do. It's not just that we're looking for groups where we're among individuals who hold the same beliefs as we do. I think that's really important. But I also think it's looking for groups where we're going to feel like we really can gain something by being in this network versus that network. So I never directly answer your question, but that's the best I can do.
Close. Brings to mind a question to my mind, something came up while you're talking about the 3 clicks of dolphins. Click 2, who was non-communicating with the human fisherman. Did click 2 get as many mullets as click 1 did, or was it just expect freeloading, so to speak?
Yeah, no. So this is a good question. So that analysis is very strongly weighted towards the time when the mullet aren't there, because it was an all-year thing they were doing the analysis on, and the mullet are only there for a little time. And it turns out that the dolphins aren't particularly clicky then. So it's not like what you would see are the individuals in the clique that have lots of signalers. They weren't particularly sticking together around each other when the mullet were there. They were mostly sticking around with each one. They were just basically looking for food on their own. They were out there just trying to get what they could and signaling or not signaling. It was the rest of the year that they were very groupish and cliquish. And then you see those clicks. So I don't think that there were any differences in the amount of, well, there were differences in the amount of food that individuals in the cooperating clique and the non-cooperating clique got, but it wasn't because of the clique, it was just because of their own behavior. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
So so if you, the way I interpret that, if you weren't communicating, you weren't getting as much when the mullet were running around because you didn't know to hang out where the fishermen were.
And you didn't signal the fishermen, right?
Okay. Anybody else have questions here or anybody on the line? You explained it so well, Lee. You did a great job. I want to thank you so much. We do appreciate your input.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it very much. I wish your group the best of luck.
Thank you. Look forward to hearing more about the macaws too. When you started talking about them, I recognized the story of them weathering a hurricane.